Okay, how many feminists does it take to get a lecture going? Well, one of them, Carolyn Maloney, who was going to be here to give greetings, is in a vote up on the hill, so we don't know what the vote is about, but maybe it's keeping the doors open here, so that's a good thing. In any case, I'm Sonia Michelle, and I'm Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center, and it's just an incredible privilege and honor to be able to inaugurate this new series called Women's History in Washington. I'm just looking at this plant here. One second. Sorry. It's very green around here. You never know where plants are going to pop up. In any case, I'm a women's historian, so it's a particular pleasure to me to be able to be emceeing this event, because women's history means a great deal to me, as I know it does to many of the people in this room. And this event is an inaugural lecture in a series called Women's History in Washington, and it's to mark both the advent of an intellectual series, a series about history, but also to fill a space until the actual National Women's History Museum appears in person, brick by brick, mortar by mortar, on the mall on the other side of the mall in Washington, D.C., which hopefully it will do in 5 to 7 years. And we had invited Carolyn Maloney, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, here to give some greetings, because she, just a few days ago, introduced a bill into Congress, the National Women's History Museum Act, which hopefully will go through Congress this year. And when it does, then the organization, the National Women's History Museum organization, will be allowed to purchase the land and start building the museum that they have been planning for many years. So I'm just delighted to be able to inaugurate this series. And in a minute, I'm going to introduce our first lecturer in the series, Marjorie Spruill, who happens to be a fellow at the Wilson Center this year. But before I do that, let me introduce Joan Wages, who is president of the National Women's History Museum, an organization that's been in existence for about 10 years, thinking about planning, gathering the resources necessary to bring something like this to pass. And it's just amazing to think about all of the resources and the thinking and the ideas and the energy, the sheer energy that's needed to make something like this happen. And Joan is just the person to do it. She was formerly a lobbyist on the Hill. She was president of a firm called Cash, Smith and Wages, which is a consulting firm in Alexandria, Virginia, that specializes in government affairs, developing strategy and communications for getting federal legislation passed. And as a registered lobbyist, she's worked on a number of different issues, including many women's issues. And one of her most important legislative accomplishments was passage of the Family and Medical Leave Act. So we are very grateful to Joan for that, as well as for many other things like getting smoke off of airplanes and a few other things that make our lives much more pleasant. So let me turn the podium over to Joan, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the museum, and then I'll be introducing Marjorie Spruill. But in any case, welcome to all of you, and thanks for being with us on this rainy afternoon to launch this wonderful series.
On behalf of the National Women's History Museum, we are particularly appreciative to the Wilson Center for partnering with us on this inaugural lecture series on women's history. This is a very exciting time for the museum. Not only are we very close to getting legislation passed, which we've been saying for a couple of years now, but now we're really getting close. But to start working with the scholars is such an important time for the museum. We had our first scholars meeting here in January, and Sonia Michelle was one of the few scholars who came together with us, and then Marjorie is joining us next month in North Carolina. And but this is a time where we start really looking at what are the organizing principles that need to come together before we can start building on them to design the interior of the museum, to decide what stories will be told, to decide what will be shown, how it will be shown. And so there is, as most of you know, there's so much about women's history. It's truly overwhelming. And so it is just our honor and pleasure that we would be working with such esteemed women who have spent their entire lives working and studying about women's history. And I was touched to the depth of my soul. I may start crying when Sonia said, "This museum is a dream come true." So not only is it a dream come true for historians, it is, I think, for all women in this country. So we are tickled to start working on this. We are just so pleased to be here today. And Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, we have worked with for many years. Some of you might remember our first project, which was to lobby Congress and raise the money to move the statue of the three suffrage leaders, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott. That statue was hanging out in the basement in the crypt of the Capitol. And so we worked with groups, and Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney took on the cause and fought for us, and we succeeded getting the statue moved into the rotunda on Mother's Day of 1997, where it still stands. Thank you. Thank you. So we say that this is what has happened to women's history. It comes to the light of day. That statue was dedicated originally in the rotunda. It then is stored down in the archives, the basement, the crypt, and is not brought into our national story. So that's the purpose of this museum, is to bring this information out so that the general public can be aware of the many things that women have done to help build this nation. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy. I'm sure you will.
Well, so many things have come together to make this day happen. That meeting that Joan referred to that we had here in January was that really incredibly snowy day. And somehow or other, everybody managed to get here by dog sled or otherwise. And once we got here, everybody warmed up very quickly, and we had a really exciting discussion about what it is that constitutes women's history. It can be so many different things. It constitutes, it brings together so many different women and their experiences and their lives at many different levels. And one of the very fortunate things also is that we have with us this year as a fellow at the Wilson Center, Marjorie Spruill, who is one of the leading historians of American women in the South, and women and politics. One of the things, women's history has gone through many different phases. We've started with suffrage. We keep coming back to suffrage. We've also gone through material culture, the history of women's bodies, women's kitchens, women's sex lives, women's you name it. We've studied it, but the theme of politics keeps coming back and coming back and coming back, and that's something that Marjorie Spruill has really kept her eye on throughout much of her historical career. Her first book was New Women of the New South, The Leaders of the Women's Suffrage Movement in the Southern States, which was published in 1993. And that book did a number of very important things. First of all, it reminded us that American women's history is not just the women of New England, which we had kind of slipped into, kind of focusing on some of the women in the colonial period in the New England states, and sometimes we would throw in New York and New Jersey for good measure, but we hardly ever got below the Mason-Dixon line. So it was really important for Marjorie's book to come out and to remind us that women were not. The women of the South were important not just during the Civil War, but especially during the women's suffrage movement, and that was a very important move. The second thing I think that Marjorie's book did was also to once again remind us that politics is front and central in women's history. Just because women have been excluded from political office and denied the vote for so long doesn't mean that they weren't involved in politics all along, and that doesn't mean that they have not continued to be involved in politics. What we've learned from books like Marjorie's and works of other people is that women are involved in politics, but they may not be involved in the same way. That women's politics look different, they sound different, but nevertheless women are always involved politically. Since publishing her first book, Marjorie has done a number of edited anthologies on women in the South, women in South Carolina, women in Mississippi. She's also done a reprint edition of Doris Stevens' memoir about suffrage called Jailed for Freedom. And she's also been involved in helping to fashion and serve as a consultant on at least two TV documentaries on the women's suffrage movement. So she's really helped to bring the issue of suffrage and women's politics to a wider audience, and that's really been very important, especially as kind of a forerunner to the kinds of things that the museum will be doing, hopefully very, very, very soon. So Marjorie has been here at the Wilson Center all year, and it's been a pleasure to have her with us. And while she's been here, she's working on a book that has the same title as her lecture today, and it is called Women's Rights, Family Values, and the Polarization of American Politics. And I think in today's talk you'll see not only many wonderful images which come to us courtesy of a number of women who have been not only writing about but also photographing the women's movement since its beginnings, including one person over here, Joe Freeman, who's also a historian of this movement, but also the photos that you'll see downstairs afterwards by Diana Mara Henry, who was the photographer of the first National Women's Conference in Houston in 1977. So we hope you'll stay and join us for a reception and a preview of that exhibit on the 5th floor right after this. But in any case, Marjorie's been working on her project all year and making wonderful progress on it, and we're really going to be getting in on the ground floor of what's going to be a terrific book. So please join me in welcoming Marjorie Spruill. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Well, it's lovely to see all of you. As they said, my presentation today is based on the book that I'm working on here at the Wilson Center, Women's Rights, Family Values, and the Polarization of American Politics, a book that, as you'll see, I'm quite excited about. I would like to say, though, that before we begin, that given this partisan, polarized political climate, it is heartening, indeed thrilling, to see the bipartisan support for the museum. This legislation providing for a National Women's History Museum to be built on the Mall and honoring all American women and educating Americans about our history. And I would like you to join me in thanking Joan Wages for her Herculean efforts to get us to this point, and in advance for bringing the project to fruition. I'd also like to say that I am so very pleased to have the opportunity to work on this project here at the incredibly supportive and stimulating Woodrow Wilson Center, where the whole point, as you know, is to honor President Wilson by honoring his belief in bringing scholars and policymakers together. And we are also pleased and proud to have former Congresswoman Jane Harmon as our new director. I also want to thank Joe Freeman, who is in our audience, who is one of the most respected authorities on women in politics, the author of many award-winning books. She's a political scientist, also a Wilson Center affiliate, and a participant in the events that I'm about to describe, and has generously supplied me with wonderful primary sources that we just returned, and also permission to use many of her photos today. And I want to thank you, Joe. And I also want to acknowledge the help of my intern, Keisha Lai, raise your hand, who is a embarrassed, who is a student at Brigham Young University and from Singapore. And her departure next week, I am already much regretting. And finally, thanks to the fabulous Director of U.S. Studies here, Sonia Michel, for organizing the events of today and for all that she has done for all of us during the year, as well as that nice introduction. Now, though the events that I am speaking of today took place back in the 70s, I am convinced, and I hope to convince you, that they have great contemporary relevance. The book that I'm writing is about the transformation of American political culture in the 70s and the origins of the highly partisan, deeply polarized political climate we now inhabit. Okay. It was working a minute ago. This is the photographer Diana Mara Henry, whose works we're about to see in a rare photo of Bella without her hat. As the women's movement grew in strength and the movement of socially conservative women mobilized in opposition, distinctly different views on women and their social roles led feminist and conservative women into a highly visible struggle for influence. And nowhere was this more public and visible than during the series of state and international Women's Year conferences in 1977. I will be talking a lot about these conferences, which are a focal point of the book. So I want to clear up at the beginning some potentially some confusion about terminology. Though they were part of the International Women's Year program initiated by the UN, this decade of the women, these conferences were actually not international. We are, because of a few technical glitches, dealing with a different set of slides and lecture, so it's not the fault of the wonderful technical staff here at the Wilson Center, and I won't say whose fault it is, but anyway.
Nor is Marjorie incoherent. She actually...
Okay. These conferences were not the same as the ones in Nairobi, Beijing, other places that you may have heard about, but they were an outgrowth of the Mexico City Conference of 1975. So the conferences that I'm referring to are actually a series of American conferences held in each state and territory and culminating in this National Women's Conference in Houston. Now, I am going to argue that they were very important for understanding profound changes in our national political culture. The conferences were sponsored by Congress to solicit recommendations for federal action and attended by over 130,000 women and some men. And they revealed much about the two opposing groups, their fundamental assumptions, policy goals, and strategies. The conferences helped galvanize feminists, as the feminist organizers had hoped, but they also helped to mobilize and unify social conservatives, contributing significantly to the right turn in American politics as social conservatives began rallying around gender issues. Now, few Americans who are alive today who were not directly involved in the 1977 IWI conferences seem to remember them. And yet, both feminist and conservative leaders regard the U.S. IWI conferences as watershed events in American history, and significantly, both claim victory in the conflict. Gloria Steinem remembers the IWI conferences as a constitutional convention for women, a major achievement of the women's movement, quote, the sort of milestone that divides our sense of time. Phyllis Schlafly regards the IWI as a major strategic blunder by feminists that played right into her hands, a battle of midway in a war between feminists and social conservatives, in her terms, one that sealed the fate of the ERA as well as gave rise to what she called the pro-family movement. And I've been fortunate to be able to interview them both for the book and to draw from that for this lecture. Now, in my view, the IWI conferences produced no definitive victory for either side. Rather, the IWI conflict ushered in a new era in American politics, the beginning, rather the end, of a protracted struggle over women's rights, family values, and cultural politics. The IWI inspired debates over policy and women's family issues linked to this ongoing dispute over the ERA contributed to the politicization of previously quiescent social conservatives and the development of the pro-family movement that grew rapidly in the late 70s, merged with economic conservatives to empower a new right in American politics, and helped put ERA opponent Ronald Reagan in the White House. After 1977, national politics would be increasingly polarized, and gender issues would be at the heart of the dispute. Steinem's Constitutional Convention for Women and Schlafly's Battle of Midway was formerly known as the National Women's Conference, the grand culminating event of IWI that became so closely associated with its host city that it was often called the Houston Conference, or simply Houston. It received worldwide publicity. On November the 18th, television audiences saw scenes of Houston airports and hotels jammed with travelers, mostly female. When Anwar Sadat suddenly decided to go to Israel, it was said that the networks had to send the B team because the A team was already in Houston. In addition to the 2,000 elected delegates, the throngs of alternates and observers, including 100 women from 56 countries, who were, by the way, entertained by Texan Barbara Bush, plus 1,500 members of the press, brought the total gathered for the conference to around 20,000. Participants ranged from students and homemakers attending their first conference to celebrities, including feminist leaders Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, anthropologist Margaret Mead, actress Jean Stapleton, who, as some of you remember, was Edith Bunker in the hit sitcom All in the Family in the 70s, and at the time, the most famous housewife in America. Martha Griffiths, Pat Schroeder, and Barbara Jordan, the keynote speaker, and then Bella Abzug, a central figure in the story. Of particular significance was the presence of 3 First Ladies from both national political parties, Lady Bird Johnson, Betty Ford, and the then current First Lady Rosalind Carter, plus the First Lady of the Civil Rights Movement, Coretta Scott King. The gala event was hosted with symbolism connecting the so-called second wave of feminism with the first. A relay team that included tennis pro Billie Jean King carried a torch of freedom to the conference all the way from Seneca Falls, New York, the scene of the 1848 conference that launched the American women's movement with its Declaration of Sentiments. And poet Maya Angelou delivered a dramatic reading of her Declaration of Sentiments 1977 that she composed especially for the occasion. And the conference was opened with Susan B. Anthony's gavel, loaned by the Smithsonian for the occasion. As I noted earlier, the establishment of the IWI program was inspired by the UN-sponsored 1975 conference in Mexico City that adopted a world plan of action to enhance women's lives and urged all participants to hold national conferences back in their home countries to involve the women of the nation in developing future policies about women's issues. At the urging of Bella Abzug, Congress authorized this series of state conferences to be held in 1977, funded by $5 million. President Gerald Ford appointed the first National Commission on the Observance of IWI, headed by feminist Republican Jill Ruckelshaus. Housed in the State Department, it was charged with developing recommendations for how the nation could become a more perfect union for women as well as for men. And its primary recommendation was the ratification of the ERA, quote, at the earliest possible moment. In early 1977, Jimmy Carter succeeded Ford and inherited the IWI program. He appointed Abzug as chair of the IWI National Commission, which had established his state commissions charged with planning conferences that were open to all comers. Note, he also appointed women that the conservatives regarded as radical, most notably Jean O'Leary, who was head of the National Gay Rights Task Force. Participants at the state level were to debate the issues, vote on recommendations, and on delegates to send on to the national conference. And in Houston, the delegates were supposed to devise a national plan of action to guide federal policy on women in the years ahead. Now, the Houston Conference was a remarkable achievement, perhaps the crest of the second wave of the American women's rights movement. The conference fulfilled 2 goals dear to the heart of feminist leaders. First, it moved the movement beyond its white middle-class base. And in fact, the act of Congress that mandated the IWI program required specifically that delegates selected to represent each state reflect the full diversity of that state's population. The state conferences provided transportation and childcare to ensure that low-income women could participate, to widen this on the basis of class. And delegates elected to the Houston Conference were fully funded. And so successful were these efforts that for some minority groups, participation rates actually exceeded their percentage in the nation's population. Second, feminist leaders hoped to move beyond the internal ideological and strategic wrangling that had been a hallmark of the modern feminist movement. At Houston, according to the official report, quote, women's rights advocates worried as much about divisions within their own ranks as they did about disagreement with the anti-change forces. Many, especially rank and file women's rights supporters, feared jeopardizing ratification of the ERA by linking it to controversial issues, particularly government-supported childcare, abortion rights, and civil rights for lesbians. So, in Houston, amidst the pageantry, the films, the exhibits, the poetry readings, the Sweet Honey and the Rock concert, women's history lessons, and occasional spontaneous outbursts of hugging, singing, and dancing in the aisles, the delegates labored in tension-filled caucuses to resolve their differences regarding what the final plan should look like. And Betty Friedan was loudly cheered when she announced to the full assembly her support for the lesbian rights plank, putting aside her well-known opposition to aligning feminism with the, quote, lavender menace, terms used before. A spirit of compromise and expansiveness prevailed. The resulting National Plan of Action reflected the goals of both the moderate, mainly middle-aged feminists who had launched the movement in the mid-60s and those of the more radical and ideologically diverse group of women who entered the movement later in the decade. Planks adopted included a wide variety of issues: equal access to jobs and credit, aid for elderly women and disabled women, displaced homemakers, federally funded childcare, an end to sex role stereotyping in schools, and international cooperation to advance women's rights worldwide and promote peace. And notable was a new plank hammered out in Houston by the Minority Caucus that, in the words of Coretta Scott King, sent a message that, quote, should go forth from Houston, that there is a new force, a new understanding, a new sisterhood against all injustice that has been born here. We will not be divided and defeated again. And a highlight of the conference was the passage of the plank urging ratification of the ERA, which produced a long and emotional floor demonstration. Adoption of the 1977 National Plan of Action, which encapsulated the goals both of this diverse group of pro-change delegates, and it filled them with a tremendous sense of accomplishment and solidarity. As one participant recalled, quote, inside the cocoon of those 4 days in Houston, we women found sisterhood, that universal sense of being together honorably for a great cause. The plan was indeed a major achievement, a compendium of the goals of the American women's rights movement at its most expansive moment, one that would continue to guide feminists in future decades. It did not, however, as the IWY organizers proclaimed, represent a consensus among American women on what federal policy should be, because solidarity within the feminist movement was not the same thing as solidarity among all American women. Even at the Houston conference, 20% of the delegates that had been elected by the states were social conservatives who opposed most of the planks favored by the feminists. And across town, another major gathering, almost as large, was taking place at the Astro Arena to protest the Houston conference and challenge its right to speak for American women. A crowd of between 15,000 and 20,000 people, estimates vary, from all across the nation attended this rally led by Phyllis Schlafly. Women had traveled at their own expense from all over the country, often in church buses, 50 buses from Tennessee alone. An all-star lineup of conservative speakers included Attorney Nellie Gray, president of the March for Life, Dr. Mildred Jefferson, an African-American physician from Boston, an at-large delegate to the conference, and president of the Right to Life Federation, and Lottie Beth Hobbs of Texas, president of the WWWW, which stands for Women Who Want to Be Women. and Congressman Robert K. Dornan of California, who denounced as a national disgrace the appearance of the former and current First Ladies at the National Women's Conference. Of course, feminist leaders knew, as they were planning all this, that from years of conflict over ERA and abortion, that there was strong opposition. But they had a confidence based on public opinion polls, a sense of momentum resulting from gains recently achieved. And thus, feminist leaders believed that other women, when exposed to new feminist perspectives and real feminists, as opposed to the negative images publicized by the media, would come to accept feminist goals, that the IWY would greatly expand their base of support, indeed serving as a consciousness-raising session of the grandest of scales. And the IWY did indeed win many converts to the cause, but rarely from the ranks of those already opposed to feminism. Rather, the very success of the feminist leaders in gaining this mandate from 2 presidents and Congress to hold these conferences at all served to galvanize the opposition, to politicize social conservatives, and to aid Schlafly and her associates in expanding their campaign against the ERA into a more enduring social movement that, beginning in Houston, they began to speak of as the pro-family movement. So how did we get to this point? Let me take you back from 77 to the early 70s. As the decade began, few would have envisioned such a strong reaction against the women's rights movement and the development of yet another women's movement composed of social conservatives. In the late 60s and early 70s, the conservative backlash that became visible in the campaigns of George Wallace and Richard Nixon, and Nixon sought to turn to his advantage, focused on race, domestic unrest, and economics, but not on gender. Politicians of all stamps seemed to be jumping on the women's rights bandwagon. In the early 70s, feminists celebrated congressional approval of the ERA by overwhelming margins, endorsed by Democrats and Republicans, the left and the right. Look at this. George McGovern, Birch Bayh, Bella Abzug, and Teddy Kennedy were all in favor, but so were Richard Nixon, Spiro Agnew, George Wallace, and Strom Thurmond. The ERA, as you know, proclaimed simply that, quote, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex, and then it gave Congress the power to enforce it. The ERA passed in the House of Representatives by 354 to 23, and by 84 to 8 in the Senate. Many states then scrambled to ratify, usually with little or no debate. By March of 73, only 8 more states were needed, and all of this occurred without ERA ratification committees in most states. Confident of victory, supporters had not felt it necessary to establish them. But to a degree not yet visible to feminists, to the major media outlets, or the general public, however, some Americans were simmering with resentment. After the publication of Nixon's Task Force on Women's Rights and Responsibilities, which tellingly was called, quote, a matter of simple justice, a few socially conservative women who'd been focusing on other issues began to view with alarm the apparent capitulation of leading politicians to the new and seemingly ascendant women's rights movement that they increasingly viewed as a threat to American women and to America's identity as a Christian nation, the leader of the, quote, free world, unquote, retaining its strength through the strength of its families. Interestingly, at first Phyllis Schlafly was not among them. Absorbed in writing books critical of America's defense policy, she regarded the ERA as something, quote, between innocuous and mildly helpful, unquote. However, in October 1972, a few months after the amendment was sent to the states, she founded Stop ERA, an acronym for Stop Taking Our Privileges. Schlafly was brought into the fight by her admirers in Florida and Connecticut who urged her to examine the issues, and also, interestingly, by Senator Sam Erwin of North Carolina, who had tried in vain to block passage of the amendment and, by the way, extended to her his franking privileges for the cause. Now, Schlafly was ideal for this role. not only because she was an experienced and brilliant organizer, but because she already had a following with enormous potential for expansion. Thank you. This was the supremely ironic result of efforts by Nelson Rockefeller and other liberal Republicans to limit her influence by blocking her accession to the presidency of the National Federation of Republican Women. Party leaders were well aware that she was the author and main distributor of a powerful small booklet you may have heard of, A Choice Not an Echo, largely credited for the Republicans' choice of Goldwater to run against LBJ in '64, which produced a landslide for the Democrats. So after losing to their candidate, Gladys O'Donnell, Schlafly and 3,000 livid supporters walked out of the Federation Convention and started their own independent conservative movement, complete with a monthly newsletter, the Phyllis Schlafly Report, and an Eagle Trust Fund to finance their work. And here is a major point, that Schlafly's organizing activities for the next decade took place largely outside the Republican Party, put her in an excellent position to attract additional support from women of Northern ethnic and white Southern backgrounds who were beginning to leave the Democratic Party in such numbers. This is the early roots of the massive realignment of American politics in the late 20th century. By '75, Schlafly had also created the Eagle Forum, an organization that served as the nucleus for a loose coalition of social conservatives who demonstrated against the ERA and abortion and would now cooperate with one another in the battle with feminists for control of the IWI conferences and the right to speak for American women. As scholars understand far more clearly than did observers at the time, religion inspired the passion many of these women poured into their activism. Indeed, throughout our history, religion has motivated women to activism, but for women's rights as well as to defend traditional gender roles. Many denominations supported the ERA, but women like Schlafly believed that God had called them to become Christian soldiers fighting against feminism in defense of traditional ideas on gender. Some of them, including Schlafly, as we know, were devout Catholics, many of them active in right-to-life groups. But by the mid-'70s, religious opponents of the feminist movement also included Mormons, who, after Schlafly reached out to their leaders, going out to Salt Lake City and meeting with them, persuaded them to declare the ERA, quote, a moral issue to be opposed by the LDS. And after this, Mormons played a key role in the battles over the ERA and the IWI, not only in Utah, but throughout the United States. And Schlafly has given them credit for helping her defeat the ERA in 2 of the 3 last battleground states. And then there were the newly politicized group of evangelicals and fundamentalists, particularly numerous in the South, to whom denial of gender differences and distinctive traditional roles for women was not only erroneous, but sacrilegious. And these included Jerry Falwell, who had previously eschewed politics as corrupting and had criticized black ministers in the '60s for mixing religion and civil rights. But in 1978, later in this decade, would create the moral majority and urge Christians to support conservative candidates as their Christian duty. Significantly, the IWI program inspired Christian conservatives to action just at the same time that new right strategists began their efforts to broaden the political power of conservatives by reaching out to the religious right. Federal support for feminist goals also angered an overlapping group of social conservatives from the far right, ones still incensed over decisions made by Congress and the Supreme Court on race. Some of the people who had taken part in massive resistance against desegregation. In the early '70s, they were ripe to be drawn into a social movement against what they regarded as social engineering or federal intrusion into the sensitive and intensely personal arena of relations between the sexes. Many of these women and men were also ardent patriots and isolationists, suspicious not only of feminism but of international cooperation, and certainly including the IWI with its UN roots and ties. Now, ironically, and here's another key point, at the time when it had become politically unacceptable to be overtly racist, when people who were searching for key code words, but being overtly opposed to feminism became increasingly acceptable, as many women insisted publicly that there were innate differences between the sexes that should continue to guide and direct legislation. You want that again? At a time that it had become politically unacceptable to be overtly racist, being overtly opposed to feminism became increasingly acceptable. Increasingly, gender became a rallying point for a wide variety of social conservatives who believed in innate, indeed divinely inspired gender differences and hierarchies. So the socialization of socially conservative women and the fact that such a variety of conservative groups, many of which harbored deep suspicions of one another and in the past had been reluctant to work together, now were coming together in opposition to feminism is one of the most remarkable developments in this story. So let me take you back to 75, the beginning of the IWI, and how the IWI made such a difference. When the act establishing and funding the conferences was passed, conservatives immediately went to battle to stop the conferences from occurring and, when unsuccessful, to challenge feminists for control of them. By 75, conservative opposition had succeeded in stalling the ERA bandwagon, and anti-feminists perceived this whole IWI program as nothing more than a lavishly funded effort to foist upon the public not only the ERA, but a whole host of other feminist goals. Schlafly, with a love of alliteration second only to Spiro Agnew, denounced IWI as, quote, federal financing of a foolish festival for frustrated feminists, and condemned the national and state organizing committees as dominated by militant women's libbers. And there's no question that they were dominated by women's rights advocates. As the state conference began in early 77, the series of conferences, the dramatic opposing definitions of woman's nature and social role were revealed more clearly than ever, as was the conviction of each side that they were the true advocates for American womanhood. In February of 77, conservatives were appalled when in Vermont, the first conference adopted resolutions supporting ERA, abortion rights, and what they called an additional anti-family goal, gay rights, and elected feminist delegates to Houston. When in March, the National Commission sent a list of largely feminist core recommendations to the state committees, committees that included enough conservatives for information to reach conservative leaders. Then they accused the feminists, again with some good point, of prepackaging the issues to be discussed as well as the slates of delegates to be considered. Conservatives then created the IWI Citizens Review Committee, headed by Schlafly associate Rosemary Thompson, which was then to monitor the conferences. Now, interestingly, though ERA opponents had claimed for 5 years now that ERA would usher in numerous undesirable feminist goals, Thompson stated that the IWI conferences and resolutions the feminists were promoting shocked traditional women like herself and confirmed their worst fears about the intentions of ERA advocates. They were horrified, she said, that if approved at the state and national conferences, these recommendations would then pass as the official wish list of American women. The Citizens Review Committee quickly spread the word among church leaders and pro-life organizations, and Schlafly called her followers to action in the May 77 Phyllis Schlafly report, and the results were soon evident. Congressmen were flooded with letters protesting the IWI, and conservative groups working in loose coalitions that varied from one state to the next, managed what the press called takeovers of several conferences, including Oklahoma, Nebraska, Missouri, Ohio, Alabama, Utah, and Mississippi. After the first of these in Oklahoma in June, an Eagle Forum leader reported that conservative leaders had relied heavily on fundamentalist church groups to tell their members to attend and to vote against the feminist slate. Conservative columnist James Kilpatrick and other conservatives relished the victory, thinking these are going to turn out differently than we thought, and concluded, quote, that the troops of Bella Abza got scalped. For the past 10 years, he boasted, the glorious Steinhams have had things pretty much their own way, and now the Phyllis Schlaflys are venturing out of their kitchens, unquote. In Utah, 14,000 men and women jammed into the Salt Palace in Salt Lake City, summoned by the Mormon Women's Relief Society to stand up for correct principles and reverse the intent of the workshops designed by the pro-IWI State Coordinating Committee. In Mississippi, a very interesting case that I have written about in depth, a coalition calling itself Mississippians for God, Home, and Country staged a takeover notable both for its stealth approach and the completeness of its victory. While only 250 people pre-registered, 1,500 attended. Many arrived in church buses and, according to the feminists, were instructed in their voting by a handful of men, including whites' rights leader and Jackson lawyer Richard Barrett, who had recently been up in New York and New Jersey assisting in the efforts to defeat state ERA proposals. This group adopted a set of substitute resolutions opposing feminism, daycare, gay rights, and abortion, and interestingly added resolutions against Social Security and messages of solidarity with Rhodesia and apartheid-era South Africa. They also sent a conservative, indeed far-right, set of delegates to Houston, including the only men elected to the National Conference. The delegates also included a woman named Alice Higgins, the wife of the Grand Dragon of the Mississippi Klan, who told the press that communists had failed to take over the country using the blacks and were now trying to do it through the women. IWI Citizens Review leader Rosemary Thompson denounced accusations that members of the Klan were in the Mississippi delegation, and they did not want to be tarred with that brush associated with them, and probably only one of them was actually a Klan member. Yet Klan members boasted openly that they had, quote, controlled the Mississippi Conference and infiltrated most of the state meetings. The state commission in Mississippi that had been appointed by the federal government was a racially diverse group of feminists who were moderate, mostly married, quite religious. Unita Blackwell, all of them were shocked at being called anti-God, country, and family, and were very suspicious that they'd seen some of these folks before. And Unita Blackwell, one of the Mississippi feminist leaders, the mayor of Mayersville, later a MacArthur Genius Award winner and a Carter appointee, was a veteran of the civil rights movement, and she declared, quote, they may claim to be for God, country, and family, but they are the same people who've been pushing blacks around in Mississippi all along, unquote. The strength of the conservatives also surprised conference organizers in states all over the country. Indiana, Hawaii, Kansas, and Montana elected delegations that were predominantly opposed to the core resolutions adopted by the National Commission. And conservatives challenged feminists in New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Illinois, California, and Washington, another state in which they took a stealth approach, with 2,300 pre-registering and 2,000 more than that arriving, and many of them Mormon. In 1975, the vast majority of state conferences, however, feminists prevailed. Participants adopted all of the core resolutions and approved, and in 11 states approved most of the core. In New York and California, attendance soared as rumors spread that Schlafly or Anita Bryant, whose Save the Children campaign coincided with this, it was that very same summer, that they might appear in person, and that social conservatives were planning to be there in large numbers. And Ellen Cohen, a feminist writing for the Village Voice, wrote an article about all this called Mama Said There'd Be Days Like This, and recognized this as a major wake-up call for feminists. She wrote, something totally unexpected and disturbing has happened in recent weeks. And she quoted a New York organizer as saying, feminists can no longer make the bland assumption that their voices will dominate any women's conference. So, as the state conferences came to a close at the end of this long, hot summer, feminist leaders were pleased with the results of many of the state conferences, But they were shaken by the extent of the opposition and the ability of conservative leaders to command the attention of the press, which had paid very little attention to the IWI until the battles for control began. And more significantly, they were disturbed by the alarming progress socially conservative women were making in convincing politicians that they, rather than the women's movement, were the constituency most important to please. And feminist leaders were furious when, after the last of the conferences, Senator Jesse Helms, working with the IWI Citizens Review Committee, organized congressional hearings where conservative women across the country testified that they had been victims of discrimination at the state conferences. And afterwards, the IWI commission members felt considerable heat from other congressmen and pleaded in vain for President Carter to attend the Houston conference. I'm going to skip ahead. As this cartoon from the Richmond News Leader attests, the rising national tensions over the IWI reached Houston ahead of the delegates. Houston's mayor remained supportive, but the newly elected Harris County Republican chair blasted the delegates soon to come to Houston as, quote, a gaggle of outcasts, misfits, and rejects. The press swarmed the celebrities, but these included the arch-conservative Mississippi delegation, especially the Klan leader's wife, who, I kid you not, expressed concern that IWI organizers were going to harass the women of their delegation by making them room with black lesbians. The National IWI Conference and the protest rally at the Astro Arena both received extensive coverage. One of the few points of agreement between feminists and conservatives was that the press seemed to relish the idea of American women engaged in a massive catfight, and that metaphor kept coming up. Schlafly's well-dressed supporters, and she generally advised sensibly that no one over 25 should come dressed in a T-shirt, carried signs proclaiming, "We're ladies, not libbers. Sin is still a sin even if it's legal. God is a family man. And IWI means Immoral Women's Year." And these images were juxtaposed in the media with images of the exceptionally heterogeneous group of IWI delegates who carried a very different set of signs, including wages for housework, keep your laws off my body, peace is a woman's issue, lesbian mothers are pro-family, and the omnipresent ERA yes. The two Houston gatherings demonstrated the major fault line that had developed in American society over gender issues. Participants, politicians, and the public were all confronted with the fact that there were now two clearly developed sets of ideas about what was best for American women. Schlafly insisted that the IWI conference had doomed ERA because it showed the television audience that the ERA and the feminist movement were outside the mainstream of America. And she charged that it weighed down the ERA by associating it with radical issues. The Houston conference inspired the feminist participants and made them all the more determined. However, the corresponding mobilization of socially conservative women, equally fired up by their experiences during IWI, would prove to be enduring and highly influential. In Citizen Review Committee Chair Rosemary Thompson's book, The Price of Liberty, published in '78 with a foreword by Helms, she characterized very interestingly the uprising of conservative Christian women against feminism as, quote, the story of God's women and their efforts to preserve America's traditional moral and spiritual values. And she compared it to the antebellum Great Awakening and other important religious revivals in American history that had held such important political consequences. Political observers at the time, including the editor of the moderate Republican newspaper, the Ripon Journal, noted that the state IWI conferences had turned into fiercely fought conflicts between change and anti-change groups, highly significant battles, he said, that presage a new coalition of social conservative groups that often hated one another before and in the future will vote similarly. He and others noted that these groups had demonstrated considerable skill in both coalition politics and convention plotting. these anti-ERA, anti-change and anti-gay rights campaigns, he said, could well become powerful if teamed with the many anti-gun control, anti-busing groups that have proliferated along with Richard Viguery's mailing lists. As for Richard Viguery and his New Right, We're Ready to Lead, he declared the New Right was working to register millions of new voters, including those who had rallied against Bella Abzug's IWI conference in Houston. Historian Donald Critchlow, Philip Schlafly's biographer, has argued that the 70s mobilization of conservative women at the grassroots level, quote, activated a disheartened conservative movement and laid the foundation for their rise to power late in the decade. Now, after the IWI, feminists remained hopeful concerning implementation of the national plan, but faced many disappointments. Feminist leaders who had clashed with Carter over abortion and believed he could have done more for the ERA were highly critical of his response to the plan, as you see in this cartoon. And when Abzug criticized the president publicly after a White House meeting, he fired her, and over half the committee resigned in protest. The firing made a feminist martyr out of Abzug, and even many moderate feminists who had thought her too polarizing to head the commission were outraged at her public humiliation. Now refused to endorse his reelection, and when he lost, aide Hamilton Jordan was quoted as saying that feminists got in Ronald Reagan, quote, exactly what they deserved. The Democrats continued, however, cautiously to support the feminist movement, though Southern leaders in particular were quite unhappy with the Democratic Party's requirement that any office seeker in 1980 who expected party support must support the ERA. As for Carter himself, social conservatives, who Viguery claimed played a huge role in Carter's 76 victory, were livid that Carter had given them, quote, the back of his hand, quoting Viguery, instead choosing to surround himself with, quote, abortionists and perverts. Now, when I had the opportunity to talk with Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, he told me that the abandonment of the feminist after he believed he had tried valiantly to support their movement, after he had appointed more women to office than any previous president, and also that it had been understood between him and Rosalind that he would have appointed a woman to the Supreme Court had the opportunity come up, that this abandonment had really, quote, hurt my feelings, unquote. He said if I did not agree with them on everything, they gave me credit for agreeing with him on nothing. Feminists were uncertain about how to respond to the increasingly combative social conservatives who, emboldened by their show of strength during IWI, sought aggressively to roll back feminist gains. Betty Friedan soon sparked controversy within the movement as she called for, quote, a second stage in which feminist women and men must perhaps give up on this idea of solidarity and must work together and not allow conservatives to paint the women's movement as anti-family. Feminists would continue to fight for the goals in the plan and make significant progress over the years toward its goals, but without the level of federal support that the movement enjoyed prior to these controversial IWI conferences and without the feminist solidarity achieved for a glorious moment at Houston. Conservative women found their champion in Ronald Reagan, who led the Republican Party to reverse its 40-year history of support for the ERA, to adopt a pro-life position, and on to victory. Republican feminists like Mary Crisp protested to no avail. Indeed, in 1980, the platforms of America's two major national parties revealed how polarized the nation had become over gender issues, and family values had joined women's rights in the political discourse of the nation. Schlafly's success in politicizing, uniting, and mobilizing religious conservatives, emulated by strategists for the far right, expanded the ranks of committed conservative activists, which enhanced their power within the Republican Party and national politics. In conclusion, the words that every audience longs to hear, the many victories of the modern women's rights movement, a movement that was as much the result as the cause of profound economic and demographic changes in American society, would not be easily undone. The defeat of the ERA was a huge symbolic blow to the women's rights movement, leaving many with the people with the impression that the movement had failed. The success of Schlafly and others, including new groups founded later in the 70s, including Concerned Women for America, their success in stopping the ERA did not stop or reverse many of the other changes supported by the feminists, though they definitely have had many victories. And yet the hotly contested IWI conferences were instrumental in America's right turn, even as they propelled gender issues to the front and center in nation's politics, where they have remained ever since. From 1980 on, America's two major political parties would both claim to have women's and family interests at heart and to compete for women's vote, especially as a gender gap began to be recognized at the time of the 1980 and 1984 presidential elections. And as we are aware, gender politics have continued to be very significant, as was very evident in the 2008 presidential race. Since the 1970s, women would have been increasingly active in politics as voters, as lobbyists, and candidates, growing in numbers and visibility, but they were not all feminist, a point of contention of late, of course, after Palin has resurrected that word, claimed to be a feminist, and there's new debate exactly on what that means. John McCain showed how little awareness of the Great Divide among American women that had developed in the 70s, when he assumed that many Hillary supporters would switch to his side simply because he appointed a woman, Sarah Palin, as his running mate. And I believe that he underestimated how very seriously women of all persuasions take their political beliefs, for the most part guided by the issues less than the gender of the candidate, though there is a gender gap. But ever since women got the vote in 1920, that women's bloc that some suffragists had predicted would save the nation and opponents predicted would ruin it, it was always a, quote, imaginative construct, as Nancy Cott has said. And given the great diversity of American women, who even when we share common goals for healthier families and a healthier nation, have different ideas about how to get there. So, as pundits struggle to understand women in politics today, as candidates and as voters, I argue that they would do well to pay more attention to the developments of the 1970s, when the polarization of feminists and anti-feminists also helped polarize American political culture. That the great debates of the 70s over women's rights and family values played a crucial and largely unrecognized role in these developments. As the personal became political, and issues were increasingly fraught with religious or moral significance, the public and politicians found consensus and compromise more difficult to achieve. The issues that divided American women into warring camps in the 70s divided the major political parties and shaped the political discourse that would dominate national politics for years to come. And today, literally today, these divisions make it difficult to deal with the pressing issues confronting our nation. I still have a naive belief, not so much in gender solidarity or that compromise is easy to achieve, but I hope that somehow we can put the long view ahead of us and as a nation find a way through this. Perhaps understanding, a better understanding of women's history, our common experiences, our needs and goals, as well as the serious disagreements about us, about what is best for American women in the nation, will help. Thank you. And now I have a little visual treat here. See the results of my playing around with my slideshow.
Dancing buttons. Well, thank you so much, Marjorie, for an incredibly rich and provocative lecture that really pulls together so many different things. And I think that one of the things it shows is that no matter which side women were on, they were incredibly active, proactive. They were not just sitting there waiting for someone else to speak up for them, but they were clearly doing it themselves. I think that Marjorie will be happy to take some questions, and so please let's hear from you. Please wait for the microphone and identify yourself. Yes, Steve.
My name is Stephen Shore. My question is, given this polarity on social issues, which you've very brilliantly documented for us, is it a coincidence that in the last 30 years we've had a much greater movement toward economic inequality, that it's almost that the more extent that voters of all genders focus on social issues, the greater the less emphasis on economic issues, and the greater the resulting inequality of earnings and of assets?
I think you're referring to the what's the matter with Kansas theory, perhaps? I mean, me either. But what I understand is that many liberals consider that the less affluent in our society don't understand their true interests. And a lot of people have accused the conservatives who are social conservatives voting with them, particularly less affluent people, which some of the social conservatives are, as not understanding their true interests, of not having a false consciousness, and that this has empowered the Republican Party to unify people across class lines and has strengthened their power. To the extent that their policies have contributed to the growth of that economic divide, your point is well taken.
Yeah, right here. Please identify yourself.
Hi, Ann Magoon. Do you follow the current status of the almost dead ERA? And if so, could you comment on what you see as the future?
Yes, what she's speaking of, some of you may know, is that since the ERA failed by being 3 states short of ratification, that there are some people who raise the legal argument that the ERA could yet still be ratified if 3 more states passed it. Now, I think I see David Kybig in the audience, who is the expert on constitutional amendments and the controversies over that. Was very believed that the leaders like Birch Bayh and Martha Griffiths, had they understood the history of constitutional amendments better, would have not put that 7-year limit on it. And I believe that Sam Ervin, who encouraged that to happen, realized better than anybody else how obstructionist the South could be, and then got in touch with Schlafly and arranged to this delay, that if they could block it in enough states in order to have it not be ratified in all 38 states during this time period when the bandwagon was really on the roll, that would give her and others time to create a grassroots opposition against it. Now, he'd probably know better than I do whether or not what the legal issues are on this, but it is something that I think is a bit of a long shot. The idea that you could take the existing amendment and make it happen by ignoring that 7-year limit, which, as we know, is long since gone. My own guess would be that what's going to happen if we get the ERA at some point, it's going to call for it to be reintroduced in Congress again and have a new starting period. I think that was looking to many people as though it was not necessary at this point. There's a distinguished legal scholar at Yale Law School named Reva Siegel, who has an article out called The De Facto ERA, in which she said that during the 70s, in the debate over all of this, that conservatives agreed on the basic principle of female equality, and that disagreed over things that they perceived as transforming America in radical and undesirable ways. But that she says she believes that jurists have increasingly ruled in favor of equal rights. However, I'm sure you're all aware that recently Supreme Court Justice Scalia stated that he did not believe that the 14th Amendment protected women's rights. And that may well bring this all up again.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have the mic. So, Alice O'Connor, I want to follow up on this economic inequality issue, and some of the things you just said kind of sparks the issue as well. What was, what was the position of the right in the opposition on things like equal pay? Did they frame it as an issue of interference with the market and, sort of drag that ideological component into it? Mm-hmm. Or did they at some level embrace, access to economic opportunity and whatnot? Because, after all, the reason why Sarah Palin can say she's a feminist, but I can't say that with a straight face, but that she can claim that mantle is because she's been economically successful and because she obviously has benefited from a lot of the achievements of the feminist movement. So could you comment on that?
I think there's actually a lot of things that feminists and conservatives agreed about. For one thing, both groups claim a proud history of the suffrage movement. And I have seen even the most right-wing opponents of the ERA affirm again and again and again, well, if this was about equal pay for equal work, I would be very much in favor. And constantly saying they are trying to trick people into believing that this is equal pay for equal work. So I don't think there's any doubt that they agreed on that and a lot of issues. I also think that they agreed that with a lot of the changes that had taken place in the 60s in terms of knocking down doors that prohibited, rules that specifically prohibited women from entering universities, prohibited them from certain jobs. So the equal opportunity, I think, was there. But what they didn't like was a perception that the feminist movement was dissing the female half of the American dream, which was to be a traditional housewife supported and able to stay in the home and take care of your own children. But I think that as far as, and then as comparable worth, as we know, got to be an issue. That, I think, is where it's one thing to have equal rights, equal pay for equal work. Comparable worth is a whole nother issue. And again, they insisted that the market control that. But I suppose the fundamental differences between the two sides, in addition to this essential debate over whether differences are innate, indeed divine, or whether they're the result of social conditioning, that is one of the main differences. But the other one is the issue of whether or not, whether or not women can, now that some of the obstacles have been knocked down, make it on their own, or whether a lot of the problems that women faced, including economic challenges, whether or not these are a social problem or whether they are individual problems. So I think that was the other part of the debate.
Yeah, right. This is a lady down here. Oh, sorry.
I have the microphone just for a moment. First of all, I want to congratulate you and very much look forward to your book. I was part of the 1970s very active movement, but I wanted to, one of the things that concerned me was that in the last 20 years or so, my daughter's generation, for example, kind of lost interest, as if it wasn't important. You know, they were achieving what they wanted to achieve, and they just lost issue. Do you think that the circumstances now and all the things that are coming to the forefront now would force some of these younger women to take notice? And that's, I think, where your book will make a tremendous contribution.
Thank you. First of all, I think the fact that younger women take for granted a lot of the victories of the women's rights movement is one of the most encouraging signs I have ever seen that it has made major progress. So, it's funny, as a professor teaching women's history, I, on one hand, frustrated by that, and on the other hand, I say to myself, that I am so glad that they're not running into the same problems that we ran into. But we have also learned that history and it does not move in a linear fashion, and that there are backlashes behind gains, and that at all times people need to understand history in order to understand that. And I believe that I think that obviously, as we know today, that abortion is at the heart of the issue now. I believe that the federal shutdown is now depending, just like healthcare legislation, on whether or not they can work this out. This is an issue, one of the hardest ones for people to ever compromise on, because there can be no consensus on it. So the debate. I think that that young women today. I think that that's the issue, that that would galvanize a great deal of them if abortion rights are changed and it's no longer legal anywhere in the country. I think that would definitely bring about a huge mobilization of young women about that issue. Now, there are lots of young women now who are working against abortion rights. My personal view, like lots of people, is that I believe it was Clinton that said it should be safe, legal, and extraordinarily rare. But I also think that if we look back in history, that we understand that there were, that in the years before it became legal, that there was an awful lot of suffering and death as a result of illegal abortions, and that is something else that history tells us that ought to be more of a part of this discussion than it is now.
Right here.
I covered Mexico City and also the Houston conferences for the Associated Press, and invented a beat on the women's political movement for the AP.
What's your name?
Peggy Simpson.
Oh, I've read some of your things. I have your Xeroxes of some of
those
those things.
The thing about writing for the AP is you don't have any clips because it's in 500 newspapers, not at any one.
I'll share some with you if you like.
But I wonder if you could. I think today the issue right now, today's 24 hours news cycle, is the Republicans trying to say it's not about abortion, it's not about abortion, it's about money, it's about the dollars. We're not going to hold it up on that. And Senator Reid saying this is about women's health. This is about women's health. And you see that being, and the Republicans are desperate to get away from this being about women's health because there is a broad support for women's health. And I think most people are only now learning that this movement is really against contraception, not just, abortion is, you can't support abortion with federal funds. That's illegal. This isn't, it's just sort of a distortion of it. But I'm curious, you were saying earlier, 20 some odd years earlier, when it was safe, no longer safe to be a racist, but very safe to be an anti-feminist. And my sense is that that would not be true today. I don't think for younger or for even the Tea Party years necessarily to say I'm really against women having an equal chance at a job out there or equal pay out there.
Yeah, well, even then, I don't think that anti-feminism was about denying that women had equal rights, but it was about social changes that people found very disturbing, and that they held the feminist movement responsible for. As a fleeting comment in that long lecture you just heard, made the statement that the feminist movement was as much the result as the cause of a lot of these changes. But that doesn't mean that people didn't hold them responsible for some of the social changes that they really did not like.
Well, we've come to a moment, and we can take a pause in the questions and answers to Marjorie's wonderful lecture to welcome Representative Carolyn Maloney, who is from New York's 14th Congressional District and hot just down from the hill, literally. We're really honored to have her with us today. We know that it's a very busy time in Congress. And just let you have a bio of Congresswoman Maloney in front of you, but just to say that at this particular moment, we're extremely grateful to her because she introduced the National Women's History Museum Act into Congress just about a week ago, and we hope that it's the beginning of great things.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I wish I had heard the lecture. It sounds fascinating. I want a copy of it. And I'm thrilled to be here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and National Women's History Museum, and to welcome Dr. Marjorie Spruill, Professor of History at the University of South Carolina. I just, the day that we introduced the Women's Museum, I had called my good friend Jane Harmon, who is now the president and CEO and director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And we worked together on many issues together in Congress. So I had called her to come to our press conference, and I said, something you ought to do is you ought to get some women in a bipartisan way to come together and talk about this museum and get some momentum so we can move it forward and get it passed. So when I got the notice in my office, I thought, boy, does Jane work fast. And I called Joan and I said, wow, did she really put this together? And then Joan told me that they had been working on it for a long time. I first would like to respond to the gentlewoman's statement and refer everybody today to an editorial that was in the New York Times on just this subject. Right now we are on the verge of closing down the United States government. When I left the floor, literally, to come over here, we were told to come back at midnight to find out whether or not the government is going to be closed or not. But what has come out of this continuing resolution that would keep it open is that it's not that much of a fight over money. In fact, the resolution even adds several million to defense, and it's not that's not what the fight's over. The fight is over the riders. And what do the riders pertain to? Women. The exact same thing you're talking about. The riders pertain to women. And it's not abortion, it's access to reproductive assistance, contraception. Because one of the riders would totally defund Planned Parenthood, which is probably the largest, and health clinics across the country, which is the largest form of health assistance, preventive care, cancer screening, all types of health and systems that help women in their health care. That's the rider they're protesting, and an environmental rider on clean water. And really, it comes right back to women. And to answer this, and I haven't read her report, but I was stunned when I campaigned for Hillary Clinton and campaigned with her in certain places. Some of the anti-woman comments, I was with her in New Hampshire where they literally held signs, go home, make me my sandwich, iron my shirt, and really attacking feminism. Whereas I believe if they had attacked President Obama, there would have been an outrage across this country. They would not have tolerated for 1 second a racist comment and a racist attack. But there was a series, there was a women's school in my district, and the girls made a film of all the media that was attacking her. It was really horrifying when you saw it all together. And Media Matters also did it, where they were saying when she comes into the room, I hear take out the garbage, and I don't like it. And when she talks, one commentator said she comes into the room, I have to cross my legs because I feel she's going to castrate me. He says this on national television. And yet there wasn't an outrage of disgust or whatever. So I think it's a fascinating subject when you look at the race of Hillary Clinton, where she put 18 cracks into that glass ceiling, and you think of the massive, really success of the women's movement. We have a woman speaker, and all of the other achievements that we've had in education, a woman who's heading the Woodrow Wilson School. Yet still you see these barriers that are there. And I thought that's a contrast. Someone should really write a book about it. Well, someone has. I wrote a book called Rumors of Our Progress Have Been Greatly Exaggerated, Why Women's Lives Are Not Getting Any Easier. And I have been thinking a little bit about Geraldine Ferraro, who is an icon in the women's movement. And I was in San Francisco in 1984 when she became the nominee of the Democratic Party, running with Walter Mondale, first one to be considered for vice president. I was a New Yorker, and people were just sort of laughing at the idea that Mondale would appoint a woman. It's not really going to happen. Yet she was appointed, and I will never forget how exhilarating, how exciting it was to see her on that stage. I was an alternate delegate, and the male delegates gave their cards to women. So the whole floor was practically women. She went to the stage, and for 10 minutes we clapped, at least 10 minutes. Everybody was handing out cigars. It's a girl. There was great joy and excitement. And I would say she changed my life. She changed the way that I looked at aspirations for myself. And I've heard many women say the same thing, that seeing a woman considered for that important position, she shattered not a glass ceiling, I would say a cement ceiling. And I would say that all of us stand on the shoulders of the women who've gone before us. I was at her funeral, and former President Clinton spoke at her funeral, but before he spoke, he was preceded by two secretaries of state, Madeleine Albright and Hillary Rodham Clinton, and a woman senator, Senator Murkowski, and a woman member of Congress, Jane Harman. And I couldn't help but think how Geraldine would have been thrilled to know that President Clinton was preceded by so many outstanding women before the president spoke. Walter Mondale said when she became the nominee, there were roughly, I think he said 16 women in the House and the Senate. Now we're 77. So we're making progress. And he said when she campaigned, she faced a lot of pushback. And one man came up to her at a fair and he said, "Young lady, do you know how to bake blueberry muffins?" And she said, "Yes, I do. Do you?" So I think that women everywhere have done a great deal to push us forward. Just to put it a little bit in perspective, I was a young lady during the 70s, and I can remember in that time, that actually back alley abortions, people were dying from them. Harassment was part of the job. It was not against the law. It was just part of the job. And people would advertise jobs for women, jobs for men. And since then, with Title VII, Title IX, just heroic achievements, we've moved forward. But in a study that I did in the Joint Economic Committee, which I chaired last year, and as I look at my career and probably women that are my age, I was always the first to ever have that position, not because of anything about me. It was just that the doors opened, and I was the first woman to walk into those jobs, and I was the first woman to be the chair of the Joint Economic Committee. So I did a series of studies on women, and one was a new look at the glass ceiling, which looked at women in managerial positions, and it looked at 74% of the women employed in America in the different fields, finance, education, communications. And it showed that we will walk in the door with the same salary now as a man, which was not the case when I was growing up. Men had they would constantly ask you, what are you doing here? You're taking a man's job. Why don't you leave? I mean, there was tremendous statements like that. And when I was working, it was 59 cents to the dollar, and my study showed it's now 77 cents to the dollar. We got a raise, but it's still unfair. But it showed that 5 years out, when you start looking at promotions, you'd go walk in the same door because of the women's movement, I'd say the labor movement and activities and of many people probably in this room that advanced equality of rights for women. But 5 years out, when they started promoting people, the discrimination started, and the gaps were deep and in many cases very strong between men and women, with the exception of the field of education and healthcare. In some cases, 17 points down. I mean, it was huge, so that there's still a lot of discrimination out there. And I have put this bill in called just to create a museum on the mall for a women's museum. I've been working on this thing for 12 years. Now, what is the objection? I mean, what is so frightening about having a women's museum on the mall? And we are not even asking for anything. We want to buy the property at market rate and build our museum. It's a bipartisan committee. Joan Wages has done a fantastic job, and she's the CEO of the National Women's History Museum, and she's done a terrific job. But there's all kinds of problems, and all of a sudden I thought we were going to be able to pass it, and now everybody's saying, well, if we do X, Y, Z, maybe we'll do... I mean, what is this? And when you think about it, we're half the population, yet what we're asking for is to create this museum 1 block off the mall with absolutely no federal money. And we're going to do everything ourselves. You know, as Ginger Rogers said, I did everything, only, backwards and in high heels that Fred Astaire did. You know, and so it's just very difficult. So I literally went through and counted all the statues in the Capitol building. There are only 9 of women of the 2,400 national historic landmarks in the country. Only 5% document women's accomplishments. And we have museums in the D.C. area dedicated to airplanes, buildings, postage stamps, but not one single location to celebrate over half our country's population and explain to our sons and our daughters the roles that women have played in advancing our nation and moving forward. So I am determined to pass this. I mean, if you can't even pass a women's museum that's bipartisan, you might as well hang up your spurs and leave. I mean, I can't imagine, but there's still, people are calling me with these complaints about it. And I just, it's just crazy. So I'm working on that, and I hope all of you will join us in doing it. You know, it took us 72 years to get the vote. We do not expect that long to get our museum, but we really don't know. And so we're working hard. I just want to mention that I did a report on the first continuing resolution, which is roughly 7 months, and it shows the massive cuts to women from birth to grave. You can find that on my website, and I wrote an article on Huffington Post about it. And there are 3 bills before Congress that are stunning in their scope, shocking in their indifference, and really unbelievable in their arrogance that attack women. One defunds Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood has been a program that has been accepted and in use for years. No federal funds are used for abortion, but Planned Parenthood is really birth control and preventive health and screening, and to try to and it passed. It passed the United States House of Representatives on the House side, not the Senate side. The second one is H.R. 3, and it is far exceeds anything to roll back a woman's right to choose. And I went back and I read Blackmun's his statement when Roe v. Wade was passed by the Supreme Court. And when he wrote his statement back in 1973, he said that women's rights and access to an abortion were being restricted more in the 70s than it was in the 1800s or any time in our history. And what H.R. 3 would do would restrict us even more. it not only codifies Hyde, which says no federal funds for abortion, but it basically says no insurance company can cover abortion. And that would be a serious situation, not even in cases of rape or incest or to save the life of the mother. So that was it's a very serious, wide-reaching bill. And the other is it's being called by the press the right to die bill, because it says that hospitals can refuse, even if it's to save a life, someone's hemorrhaging and needing abortion, they can refuse. So these are extreme measures, and you wonder why in the 21st century is this happening in America? And maybe the professor can answer this. But really, the cutbacks not only in the budget, but these rollbacks are just astonishing, really breathtaking in their scope. Now, when you think about, yet we have had massive improvements for women, massive achievements for women. One of many steps forward for women, Title VII, Title IX, anti-discrimination clauses, a right to credit, all kinds of really, really important achievements. I can remember when Newt Gingrich was our speaker a while ago, and one of my good friends and mentors was Patricia Schroeder, who was a great advocate for women. And she came to me on the floor one night, and I tell this story to just show how hard it is to get anything done. And she says, it's going to take a New York woman to get the women out of the basement. And I said, well, what in the world are you talking about? She said, well, the New York women are in the basement, meaning Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she told the story that the author of the Equal Rights Amendment, Alice Paul, and a great suffrage leader for the right to vote, had commissioned a statue to be put in the rotunda with all the other revolutionary leaders, to have our revolutionary leaders there with Lincoln and Washington and King and Jefferson, all our great leaders, to have the leaders of the women's vote that gave their life, literally were force-fed, put in prison and everything else, ridiculed for fighting for the right to vote for women. So the statue was put into the rotunda, where it stayed for about a week. And there was an inscription on it that said, women empowered with the vote will rise up and fulfill their true potential. Well, the inscription was wiped off the statue and called blasphemous, and the statue was moved to the basement where it stayed. So I said, oh, that'll be easy. It's just symbolic, sort of like a museum. So I put a bill in to move the statue out, and I worked with Joan and the women's movement, the Women's Museum, on this. And all of a sudden, there was such a pushback like you wouldn't believe. I even started a newsletter, every excuse that's fit to print on why they can't move the statue. Every week I'd put out the last 10 reasons they're giving me. I'm just going to give you 3. One of their first reasons we called the engineer's report. And they said I absolutely could not move the statue because the floor could not hold it. They forgot that it had been in the rotunda. So we went out and raised $75,000, hired an engineer who issued a report and said the floor would hold the statue. Then they came back and they said, we're not moving any new statues into the Capitol. None. 0. Meanwhile, they moved in the disgraced Vice President Agnew, who was a statue of Agnew, who was, I think, even went to jail for bribery. I mean, and so this guy was moved into the Senate side as a vice president. And I'm sure that the men did not have to pay to build that statue. And again, we were paying for everything. So then finally, Newt Gingrich was a historian, and I appealed to him when he was in the speaker's chair one night. I said, this is history. This is part of the historical movement of America. We have to move the statue. And he agreed. It is history. We should move the statue. So he agreed to pass the bill. So we were in what we call the women's meeting room. And one of my good friends on the Republican side of the aisle that was helping me pass this bill came running in, and she said, we can't move the statue. I was just at the caucus meeting. They won't let us move it. We're going to move this other statue of this very attractive woman I never heard of into the Capitol. And we're sitting there dumbfounded. And, And we said, why? Why can't we move the statute? She says, well, our caucus thinks that the women are too ugly, and we're going to move in this other more attractive statute. At which point, Patricia Schroeder said, have you looked at Lincoln recently? And we moved and our great revolutionary leaders are now in the rotunda, not on their looks, but of their massive contribution and selfless devotion to moving the rights of women forward. So my question to all of you today is to find some issue that you care about, that you'll spend your time on, that could be as important as what our founding mothers did in sacrificing really their lives and their time to give us the right to vote. So I'm thrilled to be here. I want to have a place that we can put all that history and documentation. That's why I'm championing this museum and working very hard to get it through the House. We passed it last Congress, did not get through the Senate, and we're working to get it passed this year. And hopefully this lecture series will be part of momentum that can help us get behind passing this important piece of legislation. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'd be delighted to take questions and join in any discussion you have. And thank you for being here, and thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for allowing us an opportunity to discuss these issues that are important to our culture and our history and our future. Thank you.
Okay. We all will. The Congresswoman would be delighted to take some questions. Is this your more questions? Yes, right there. Please identify yourself.
My name is Gail McGinn, and I'm just wondering why the museum didn't pass the Senate last time around.
Therein lies a tale.
Well, when I get behind an issue, I mail my flag to the masthead and talk about it everywhere I can and push it in every way I can, because I feel in a democracy the grassroots will help you when you're right. The senators who were backing this and were our allies wanted to be very quiet about it. And I'm sitting there, why do you want to be quiet? But that was their approach. They wanted to be quiet. They didn't want a press conference. They didn't want a forum. They didn't want petitions. They didn't want anything. They wanted to be quiet about it. Well, when you're quiet about it, you empower your opposition. And apparently the Concerned Women of America came out in opposition to it, and they didn't want it built. And so a lot of members could stop it. And in the Senate is very different from the House. The House, you go to a majority vote, and that's it. In the Senate, one senator can sit there and say, I don't like it, and stop it. It's very undemocratic, and they don't even have to say why they don't like it. But some people did not like the idea that maybe someone like Margaret Sanger might be, respected in a museum. I mean, to me, I can't understand it. We are paying for the land. We are paying for the building. It is totally bipartisan. We have a not-for-profit that is half Republican, half Democratic, with very strong leadership. We have Republican men and women supporting it in the House and the Senate. And anyway, they killed it. So I think this time around we should be more vocal about it. The last bill that we passed in the last Congress was a bill that I authored. It took me 7 years to pass it. A lot of people think we're in Congress passing all these bills. It's very hard to pass a bill. And it was called the 9/11 Health and Compensation Act. And I thought at the very least we should give health care to the men and women who risked their lives and are dying because of 9/11. We lost 3,000 on 9/11. We've lost thousands more because they don't have health care. They're sick and dying. And one senator was holding it up. But at least we could have all the police and fire from his district go and talk to him about it. And also the police and fire from across this country were camped out in front of his office, and he finally changed his mind. So I think that, and did the right thing and helped the bill and finally passed it. So I think you should put it out in the open and have a debate about it with the American public and bring the American public to bear on it. This is a museum. This is a place to have meetings like we're having today to discuss history and values and inspiration and future. And to me, I think it's a tragedy that it did not pass. And and I'll be working very hard to get it through the Senate, and I hope that the board will have a different strategy in the Senate. I don't think you should be quiet. I think you should be very vocal about the fairness of allowing this to happen. And again, this is not a tax on anyone. This does not hurt anyone. This is going to be raised with private dollars. We've already gotten a $1 million commitment and many funding from Meryl Streep, the actress. And there's another area, another person who's been talking about roughly $60 million. I mean, so there's money out there that could be used to build it, and I think it's a tragedy that was stopped.
Other questions? Right, yes, please.
Hi, my name is Roxanne Zer. Which senator is the one obstructing the bill?
Well, the senator who obstructed the 9/11 bill was Tom Coburn. On this one, it hasn't gotten to the Senate yet. We always have a fresh start, so we hope everybody will be with us. And let's be positive and hope they'll all be with us. So we're not going to name names because hopefully they've changed their mind from last year and will be with us.
Other questions? Yes.
Steve Luck at Georgetown. Congratulations, Marjorie. To the extent we're talking about women and historic women, could the pair of you, or even, I guess, the quartet, look at the face of the United States as represented by women today? The First Lady, Dr. Rice, Ambassador to the United Nations, and Secretary of State Clinton.
Yeah. So what's the question?
Oh, right, what was the question?
The face that the United States is showing to the world being represented by women, like our First Lady and our Secretary of State and our envoy to the United Nations. Can you just sort of give us your sense of the history of that?
Well, I think that it's remarkable. I never thought that a woman would be considered seriously for the Supreme Court. Now we have 3 women that have been on the Supreme Court. 4. And I remember when the first one was appointed, Sandra Day O'Connor. It was very thrilling, but now we've literally had 4 different women appointed, and the breakthroughs for women are astonishing. I would say that for every woman that's on the Supreme Court, there are millions more that are on the factory floor or in jobs that are discriminating at them at 70 cents to the dollar. So we still have a lot more work to do. I would say that more important than the first person who takes a position, I can remember when Madeleine Albright was being considered for Secretary of State. A lot of people were ridiculing it and thinking it would never happen. The second appointment is almost more important because, of course, a woman can be Secretary of State. Now, we've had 3 women that are Secretary of State. Just this past weekend, good news came in 3s. President Obama announced his reelection. I happen to be a Democrat, so I'm supporting President Obama. Tom Kean, who was the DNC chairman, decided to run for the Senate in Virginia, and he has a very good shot and would be an excellent senator. And my roommate in Congress, we share a house together, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, was appointed by President Obama as the first woman to head the DNC. So with every appointment, I think that it raises the aspirations of women and men, and the idea of equality and opportunity is something that I think all Americans share. But statistics are still very disturbing. Even though women are making up the majority of law schools, very few of them become partners. I can't think that that's because they're not talented enough to do the job. So I do still think that there's a lot of work that has to be done, but I also believe that America is the greatest country on earth. One of my good friends is Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, who is a Republican head of the International Relations Committee. She's a Cuban American, and she tells me every day she wakes up and kisses the ground and says a prayer and thanks God that she's in America. Where else could a refugee come and end up in the United States Congress? So it still is a land of massive opportunity and the greatest country in the world in terms of how we treat our people. But there's still room to make more improvement. We still haven't passed the Equal Rights Amendment. That merely says that men and women should be treated equally. So are we surprised if there is discrimination if we can't even pass the Women's Museum, for goodness sakes?
Well, you know how subversive that is.
I'm just going to say that, yes, it is absolutely thrilling when you see black and women's faces joining those of white men in these positions. And I was up at Harvard when my friend and fellow historian Drew Faust became president. You talk about It's a Girl things. We plastered the place with balloons. It was extremely exciting. And then shortly thereafter, the Radcliffe Institute held a program in which they invited all of the presidents of Ivy League universities to come for a panel. When the word came out during the day that everybody within several states' range intended to be there, they had to move it to a giant place. And the moment that they walked out on the stage, before they said a word, the place just went crazy. And so these examples are very, very thrilling. As you say, Michelle Obama not only is very inspirational to African Americans, also inspirational to women, and it is all the more poignant when you hear some of the things that we've been hearing this year at the Wilson Center, because one of the fellows is a New York Times reporter who's doing her project on tracing back Michelle Obama's ancestry to slavery in the state of South Carolina, where I live. And finally, I have to say that a few months before Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, there was one of those infamous, horrific incidents in the Middle East where there was a woman who had been walking down the street with a man and holding hands and now was going to be stoned to death. Mm-hmm. And I thought to myself, what kind of a message does it send throughout the world when she's the Secretary of State? And I just think that not only are we fulfilling our historical dreams when we have women in these high places, but it is also going to influence history by inspiring another generation to reach this kind of heights.
Yeah.
Trish Kent, I'm a resident of D.C. I have no senators. What can I do to help get this measure, either the rider for Planned Parenthood, taken off this important bill, or to get it passed, because it's as scary as anything. I mean, I was in the 70s and taking my friend for a legal abortion, and we celebrated that she could have one. Mm-hmm. And now I have daughters that scares the heck out of me that may not be able to have them if they so desired one, for whatever reason.
Well, Eleanor Holmes Norton, your representative, does not have the vote. She does work incredibly effectively. We bring it to the floor, and I work with her we're on the same committee, Government Reform and Oversight, that has the jurisdiction of D.C., and we have brought it to the floor for numerous votes to give the vote to your elected representative, Congresswoman Norton. And she is one of the leaders in Congress in opposition to this outrageous rider. And there are many Democrats, and I would say Republicans, who agree with us, but a lot of times they're party votes, and this has appeared to be a party vote. I hope it will not happen. As I said, I urge you to read the editorial today in the New York Times, which says it's not about money, it's about riders on the environment and to put women down and back. And I don't quite understand it. This is the 21st century. We made massive gains in the 70s, and I'd like to ask the professor about it. I'll tell you another astonishing thing that happened in the last Congress, and that's the Lilly Ledbetter Act. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Lilly Ledbetter. This was a woman who had gotten A+ on her work when she worked for a tire company, and then when she's getting ready to retire, she gets a note in her box from one of her male colleagues saying, "Did you know that the young man who was just hired is making 30% more than you?" And she then complained and said that she had been discriminated in her pay. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that if you didn't raise the issue within 6 months after you were hired, then you could never raise it. So, and that meant men, women, minorities, I don't care who you were, you couldn't object to pay discrimination. It was a horrifying decision. We changed that with the Lilly Ledbetter Act that we passed in the House of Representatives. It went to the Senate, and it didn't pass the Senate in the 21st century. We had to come back with a Democratic president, and President Obama, the first bill that he signed into law was the Lilly Ledbetter Act. But what was astonishing to me, that something as fair as letting someone object if they're being discriminated against was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States. We had to go back, change the law on it. And what I don't understand, I'd like to ask the professor who studies this, why is this happening in the 21st century? It's an attempt to roll back rights that we won in the 70s. I don't understand it. Why is there such a backlash to the Equal Rights Amendment? That should be like having a cup of water, that people should not be discriminated against. And I'd like some insight, so I'm going to throw one to the professor.
Well, in the hour before you got here. No, I don't know. It's so hard to know why people would want to roll back these gains. And one thing that, I don't know whether this is dodging or answering the question, but when I think about how so many of those gains that we made have been the result of the 1964, the Title VII to the 64 Civil Rights Movement, how many of you know that that was introduced originally as a means to try to keep that Civil Rights Act from passing?
Whoa, I never even knew that.
Really? Okay. Well, it is really quite striking that it was introduced by a Southern congressman a senator who was opposed to the Civil Rights Act. And then after that, Martha Griffiths and others in Congress just said, "Whoa, we're not going to let this opportunity pass." And then President Johnson wasn't going to let the Civil Rights Act not pass because of this, and everybody got behind it. And it is astounding how much of the progress that we made in the rest of the 60s and through the 70s and to this day has been rooted in that piece of legislation. The 14th Amendment was not passed with women in mind. And over again, feminists appealed to that 14th Amendment throughout the rest of the 1800s and into the 20th century, and we got nowhere. The idea that is going to protect us in this era is I already doubted that before Justice Scalia just told us that it didn't. But we have gained a great deal from this sort of accident in history where we got that. And I found in South Carolina, in writing about some of the feminists in South Carolina, they're up against a lot. And we're not able, just like with the case of the suffrage movement, we're not able to get very far in terms of convincing the state legislature to approve either the ERA or many other things. But what they did was to turn around to that piece of legislation from 1604, and just like they did after the 1920 ratification of the 19th Amendment, was to make the state enforce federal legislation. So I would just say that, that we are going to have to continue to work for these things. We're going to have to continue to fight for these things. And if I may, through a greater knowledge of women's history, understand how that's done and why it's important to do it.
Well, I think we've one last question. Make it fast.
I was with
Carolyn on the Hill yesterday, and I have a question to ask you, Professor, and that is, what does your research show of the number that we need to make the difference in business and in public life? Is it 1/3 women? Is there a number? No, because I have heard that a lot. I mean, it's the only body where we have that is an appointed body at the United States Supreme Court. What kind of research are you developing that would be quantitative?
Actually, as the social scientists do that sort of work. I am not doing that work, but as far as I'm concerned, 52% looks pretty good to me.
Well, on that note, I think we've been here. We've worked very hard for the last couple of hours. We are very grateful to Congresswoman Maloney for taking time to be with us and bring us messages from the Hill. Some of them good, some of them bad. But the most important and most encouraging message is that she's here and she's working so hard to make the National Women's History Museum a reality. And thanks again to Marjorie Spruill for giving us such an inspiring and really rich and wonderful inaugural lecture. And thanks to Joan Wages for her stalwart support and fighting and struggle to make the National Women's History Museum a reality, and also to partner with me in bringing this series forward. And stay tuned, next year we're going to have another round. We're going to have a whole year full of lectures like the one you heard today. So I'm really looking forward to that. So please join us on the 5th floor where we have a reception waiting for you, and you can take a look at Diana Mara Henry's photographs from the first National Women's History Conference. Thank you for coming.
Marjorie, may I